even in the darkest of situations, even when events actually suggest that he's not on the throne of heaven. And so I have a plan here, and it's this. I'm afraid it's a bit of whatever you call it, all beginning with F. Herod's fortune. Secondly, Herod's fear. Thirdly, Herod's fraud. And fourthly, Herod's fury. So you've got his fortune, his fear, his fraud, and his fury. Let's come to the first of those, Herod's fortune. And really I'm just focusing on Matthew chapter 2 verse 1, where it reads, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king." In the days of Herod the king. Now, I'm using the word fortune in this heading in the sense of what comes about as things happened. Now, we know that God is over all things, that he is sovereign, but in the world of men, we sometimes speak about fortune and misfortune. I'm not giving it any kind of theological importance at this stage. And it so happened that when our Lord Jesus was born, Herod was the king of the Jews. That's simply the point. God is sovereign. And I suppose if this story tells us anything tonight, it tells us that God picks what appear to be the most difficult times to intervene in human affairs. And that is a demonstration of his divine sovereignty. Now, in many legal documents and statutes, in our country at least, it's common to, in the preamble, state, "in the year of our Lord," and then it'll give the date, "in the year of our Lord." Maybe that's used over here sometimes, I don't know, but "in the year of our Lord." But the interesting thing is that in Matthew's Gospel, and in Luke's too actually, in that brief reference to Herod, it's "in the days of Herod the king," which seems to suggest really that that's where it was all happening. There wasn't much going on in heaven. It was all going on earth, there in that little country called Judea, in the days of Herod the king. And I suppose what it does is reveal to us yet again this great antithesis, this great opposition between what man is doing and what God is doing, and particularly what man proposes to do, human plans, human ambitions, and the outworking of God's will. I'll come back to that in a little while. So God's timing is, to say the least, very interesting. Very interesting. Because we seem to be in the time of Herod's fortune. Herod was an imposing presence. Now, I think we need to get a sense of proportion. The kingdom of Judea was tiny. It was just tiny. And when you look at it against the background of the whole Roman Empire, I mean, it was really a kind of nothing place. But within the confines of Judea, Herod certainly had an imposing presence, and he cast a very long shadow. He'd been appointed by the Emperor Augustus, effectively as king of Judea around 37 BC, and he ruled until about 4 BC. He'd had a few years before all that as a kind of lesser king, but those are roughly the dates, 37 to 4 BC. And the year of his death is probably the year that Matthew and Luke mention in their Gospels. The other source of information, in fact the major source of information about Herod, is in the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote the Jewish Wars. Now, Josephus was a Jew, but he went over to the Romans. He knew which side his bread was buttered. And he did that at a very convenient moment and survived all that was to happen to the Jews a bit later on. And he wrote the Jewish Wars, and he supplies a lot of supplementary information about men like Herod. And so if you read what Josephus says, the title Herod the Great was probably justified from one point of view. He certainly put this little kingdom on the map of the empire in a certain way. He built the great temple at Jerusalem, or he enlarged that temple at Jerusalem and made it a very grand structure. He built the city of Caesarea, which appears in the New Testament on a number of occasions in honor of Augustus. He ran a very efficient administration. There was a good infrastructure. It was so good, in fact, that when there was a time of famine in the land, he was able to ensure a constant supply of food for his subjects. And yet he had an awful reputation. Hardly anyone liked him. Most people feared him, but it was very much like a police state, and you couldn't make your feelings very clear. One of the reasons why the Herod family wasn't liked among the Jews is that they weren't really Jews. They were, in New Testament language, called Idumeans. They were Edomites, descendants of Esau, and traditional irritants and enemies of the people of God through history. Now, in the generation before King Herod, the Herod family had been forced to convert to Judaism. And so Herod and his kindred were brought up as Jews. So they learned things Jewish. But that Jewishness was just skin deep. And this background is relevant. It was skin deep. And actually they were greatly influenced by Greco-Roman culture, and Herod had set upon a deliberate policy of Hellenizing, Greekifying, if you like, Jewish society. And so you had this facade of Jewishness, but a libertine lifestyle. And he actively suppressed a number of aspects of Jewish culture. So here you've got a strange mixture. On the surface, a Jew, he actually observed the Jewish dietary laws. He wouldn't eat pork, for example. So he was very strict about things like that. And yet at the same time, he persecuted the Sadducees, something awful. He was a mass murderer, actually. And he even killed off members of his own family. So he wasn't a nice man, actually. And he was totally unscrupulous. And there's something else about him that we pick up from the text here, and also from this man Josephus, and that's Herod's paranoia. His paranoia was a big factor in the way that his reign unfolded. It's reflected, first of all, in the fact that he'd had a difficult time to establish himself as king of the Jews. He'd had to manipulate, and he'd had to be ruthless in putting down rivals and so on, which meant that he could never relax, and that would come back to haunt him many times over. That's the trouble with people who achieve leadership by violence. They don't know which enemy is going to have a go at them at a given point. So he could never relax. And this is attested in Matthew, you see, this sense that everyone was out to get him. in his desire, first of all, to kill Jesus, his intention to kill the wise men, and also the fact that he killed those little children in Bethlehem and the surrounding area when he knew that he'd been deceived. So none of that was exceptional for him. That was how he was. He murdered close members of his own family. He murdered his wife, had some sons murdered, and so on. He was just a thoroughly depraved, wicked man. And he had this kind of depressive paranoia, which manifested itself right up to the time of his death. Josephus tells the story that he knew that people didn't like him. And he knew also that he was dying. Apparently he had a horrible death. So as the time for his death drew near, and he knew that he didn't have much longer to live, he actually gave instructions for some of the leading men of Jericho to be assembled and killed at the time of his death, so that there would be mourning in Israel, because he knew that nobody would actually mourn for him. That's the kind of man he was. So that's the scenario. That's Herod, that's Judea. That's the situation into which our Lord Jesus came. And so we come back to this thing about God's timing. We're going to revisit it. You have a country in the grip of a paranoid, depressive, who's instinctively committed to destroying every apparent challenge to his position and authority. And then God chooses this moment in history to intervene. Why? It's something of a mystery, isn't it? Because he intervenes in the form of a baby. And the survival of that baby is paramount, absolutely essential to the fulfillment of his redemptive plan. And so on the surface, it seems to make no sense. Of course, those of us who know our Bibles realize that this isn't the first time that God has done it this way. That is the story of the history of redemption all the way through. The first promise of the gospel was made in the context of the fall. Excuse me. Adam and Eve had just broken fellowship with God. And then when God renewed his promises to Abraham and said, I will make of you a great nation, and in your descendants shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, he was an old man. Worse still, his wife was an old woman and they didn't have any children. So you can see that things have been like this from the beginning. Or take the sacrifice of Isaac. When Abraham did eventually have a son, what did God say? Sacrifice him. Where then the promises? Or Israel in Egypt. They were faced with extinction. That would have been the extinction of God's plan. If the people had actually been destroyed there and then, the promise of a great nation, the promise of a promised land even, would all have gone up in smoke. And so it goes on. When the exile came and the Jews were taken away into captivity, what was going to happen to the promise made to David that he would never lack somebody to sit on the throne of his kingdom? So, there never was a good time. That's the point. And yet it seems so characteristic of God that it's at those points in history that he intervenes. And the threat to his promises and the threat to his plan and purpose actually emphasizes and underscores his absolute sovereignty. And I take courage from that. I don't know about you. The doctrine of the sovereignty of God is, of course, problematic to people, but I think it's a very practical doctrine, actually, and it does me good, because it encourages me